Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We are going way, way, way back in history today. We're going to the channel Geographics with our friend Simon Whistler, who is going to be telling us all about the pyramids of Giza. This is a place I very much hope to get to at some point once things calm down a little bit in that part of the world. Might even do a group trip there if possible. So we'll see what happens, but in the meantime, I'm excited to dive into some Egyptian history. I'll admit up front, Egyptian history is one of those areas that I'm certainly no expert in. I haven't gone reading a bunch of books on the topic like I have with a lot of other topics, but I've always been fascinated by it. And some of the oldest written histories that we have anywhere in existence have to do with the old kingdom of Egypt. So I'm interested. I want to learn more. I'm sure I'm going to learn some things, and I'll try to add what insight and context I can where possible. The link is in the description to the original content. Let's go ahead and dive in.
The free-to-play game World of Warships. Get started today through the link below. Use the code BattleStations2020 to get a bunch of free stuff. More on them in a bit. Even today, in a world of skyscrapers nearly a kilometre high, they remain impressive. To the ancients, they must have looked like the gods themselves had decided to build upon the plain. The Great Pyramid alone weighs nearly 6 million tons and stood as the tallest building on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. The only surviving wonders of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, they are as remarkable today as in antiquity.
Absolutely. When you start looking at the logistics involved in building any one of these pyramids, how big they were, understand the tools they were using. No, it wasn't aliens that built them, okay? We did have the technology to do this. It's just, it was a massive undertaking of man hours to do this. And so you were throwing a ton of work toward that at the expense of probably a lot of other things you could have been building. But to put this in perspective, let's look at the historic tallest buildings over time. So first of all, the idea of a tallest building or tallest structure is always a little bit subjective because it depends on what you mean. Are you talking about just any structure at all? Are you talking about an inhabited building? Are you talking about the part to which people inhabit? Because then you have spires on top. Or are we just talking about whatever reaches the highest? So for a long, long time, I mean, for a while it was the Pyramid of Djoser, 2650 BC. But since around 2570, again, we don't know exact dates on when this stuff was built. We can only approximate. But from 2570 or so, and we're talking about 3,881 years that this thing was the tallest structure on Earth. And it's not just about how tall it is, but just how massive it is and how heavy it is. So it had eroded some by 1647, but starting in 1311, the Lincoln Cathedral in England holds the title, and it holds it for 237 years, and then you've got various churches for a long time, different cathedrals. Notre Dame for a few years holds the title, but Eiffel Tower in 1889 obviously goes and basically doubles the title. From 555 feet to over 1,000 feet. Then you've got the Chrysler Building, Empire State. You've got a tower in Moscow, the CN Tower in Toronto. And then since 2007, it's been the Burj Khalifa, which used to be called the Burj Dubai, in Dubai, which is 2,700 feet. Crazy.
Buildings crafted with such skill that they've possibly never been equaled. But what did it take to make such monumental structures a reality? What kind of civilization could create a tomb that transformed the very landscape? Arising circa 2575 BC, the Old Kingdom's 4th dynasty was one of the most impressive regimes in history. They centralized governance, pioneered new concepts of engineering that would stand the test of time. And they did it all with nary an alien in sight. In today's Geographics, we're going to be diving into the history of the pyramids of Giza, the last remaining wonders of the ancient world. To understand the story of the pyramids, we have to travel back through time, back far beyond the American Revolution, beyond the Norman conquest of Britain, beyond the Roman Empire.
So he mentions all of those things, and they all seem so far away. You know, as Americans, our history is really, relatively speaking, so incredibly new that it's often said that to Europe, to Americans, 200 years is old. And to Europeans, 200 miles is far. And that's really true. I mean, 200 miles to us in America is no big deal to drive. Like, I'd make a day trip somewhere 200 miles and then drive the 200 miles back. But our concept of old is nothing. But then you go to something like Westminster Abbey, which is going on 1,000 years old. And that seems really, really old to me as an American. And that's new compared to the pyramids. It's all relative.
Homer and the fall of Troy, all the way back to 3100 BC. It was around this date, we can't be sure of the specifics for reasons we'll get into in a moment, that a king called Narmer unified the warring kingdoms centered around the fertile wetlands of the Nile. From the newly conjoined states arose a mighty civilization, one so advanced it would continue to fascinate people 5 millennia later.
Yeah, once we get into 3 to 4,000 BC, we're talking about the beginning of recorded history. I mean, recorded history doesn't go back any further than that. I want to say 3,500-ish is where we're going to first get the first bits of recorded history. I mean, because before that, you're really not even dealing with an alphabet yet. So Egypt is about as old as history itself. And by history, I mean what we've written down, because that's really what history is. Before that, you're talking about prehistoric.
This was the civilization that today we call ancient Egypt. At least, that's one version of the tale. The reality of making a video about ancient Egypt is that you're always going to have to fill your narrative with caveats to make clear how much is still uncertain. For instance, it may not have been Narmer who united Egypt. He's just our best guess. There are other candidates, like a dude called King Scorpion, who we like to imagine looked like a really terrible CGI version of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. The reason for this uncertainty is that it all happened a really long time ago. Narmer's reign occurred at a time so impossibly remote, it's tricky to even comprehend. When Julius Caesar visited Europe, for example, Narmer was ancient history to him.
Julius Caesar is closer to us than Narmer was to him. By quite a bit. And people often use the example of saying that Cleopatra was born closer to the invention of the iPhone than she was to the creation of the pyramids. Also true. That's how old this stuff is.
A bit of a twist on one of our favorite oft-repeated facts. Cleopatra was closer in time to YouTube than she was to any of Narmer's direct descendants. So yes, it can be tricky to be precise about any of this stuff. Just remember that whenever this video gives a date, we mean around that time.
And this is so much of history, especially the further back we go when we have so few actual written sources and we're having to rely on interpretations and guesses. That's really what this is about. And so if somebody comes along and says, that's not wrong, or that's not right because this is what it says, well, that just means it's a different interpretation of it. And we're all just guessing.
Whenever we narrate an event, just imagine we've opened with this phrase, this is probably what happened. Anyway, what probably did happen is that Narmer died, and 500 years later, a distance of time greater than that separating you and Oliver Cromwell, a guy called Giza finally got around to building the first pyramid. Giza was the founder of the Old Kingdom's third dynasty. Before he came along, Egyptian kings got interred in things called mastabas, sort of proto-pyramids that looked more like stacked-up rectangles. Initially, mastabas are exactly what Giza was keen on building too. But something changed. At Saqqara, around 2630 BC, the guys building Giza's mastaba seemed to have realized that they could just keep on building up and up and up, and, well, they did. The result, the first pyramid in Egyptian history. Looking at the pyramids of Giza today, it's clearly a prototype, topping out at 62 meters.
And you can see the first layer really just looks like a mastaba, and it's about that same height. And so they just kind of kept going. And probably some engineer was like, it would be really cool to experiment and see what happens.
It's less than half the height of the Great Pyramid. It's also stepped, meaning the sides rise up in visible levels or steps rather than smoothly. Still, Joseph's pyramid kicked off a craze for tombs shaped like deformed Toblerone, and it would only be a matter of time before someone perfected what he had started. That someone arrived a mere half-century or so later. The short-lived Third Dynasty gave way to the Fourth Dynasty, led by Snefru, circa 2575 BC. Now, Snefru is a big deal, despite being somewhat anonymous. We don't know a whole bunch about him, except that he came from Middle Egypt and was super into highly centralized government. Yet his name would become a byword for a golden age in ancient Egypt. For most of the less ancient world, like the Greeks and the Romans, he was seen as a model king. He was also an absolute master at building pyramids. At first, Snefru cut his teeth building step pyramids, like old Joseph, but at some point in his reign, he decided the time had come to go one step further.
This is how scientific discovery happens. It's about, okay, here's what we've done. How can we improve it? How can we make it bigger, better, stronger, sleeker, whatever it might be? And so you're always looking for ways to make it a little better. And the process is really no different than it is today. We're always improving on and building on the work of those who came before us.
At Dashur, the pharaoh commissioned a pyramid without the steps, a smooth-sided colossus unlike anything ever engineered before. Known today as the blunted pyramid, it would become the model for all of ancient Egypt's greatest hits. Now, the blunted pyramid, it wasn't perfect. If you look at pictures, it clearly bulges weirdly at the bottom, which may have been a screw-up or may have been meant to symbolize something, we just don't know. But weird bulge or no weird bulge, it didn't really matter. The Egyptians finally had the basic techniques down for building a smooth pyramid. The next step, well, that would be build the biggest, smoothest pyramids the world had ever seen.
And you might say, well, they don't look very smooth now. Well, they didn't look like that 4,500 years ago.
The rest of Snefru's reign passed in an orgy of construction. His Red Pyramid, for example, was so perfect and had a footprint so large that it remains the third largest in Egypt after the first two at Giza. And fun fact, we're still not totally sure about how he went about building it. One theory is that it was aliens. Not really. One theory is that Snefru drafted thousands of agricultural workers after the harvest to work during the deluge season when the Nile floods and nothing could be grown. Although these builders didn't have a lot of choice, they were probably paid and free to return to their labor afterwards.
He makes a great point. A lot of people think, well, in order to have built something that big, you must have been using slave labor. And of course, your thoughts go to things like the Israelites mentioned in the Bible who wouldn't have been anywhere near Egypt at this point. Even if we're going to assume that everything is to be taken at its face value in the Bible, the Israelites weren't there for another 1,000 years after that. But these were definitely mostly going to be skilled laborers who knew what they were doing. It doesn't mean there wasn't a lot of unskilled labor helping, because there's a lot of unskilled tasks that could be done as well to move the stuff, to get it into place, but the actual building itself required a very highly skilled laborer set.
So, to shoot down a persistent myth, not slaves by any reasonable stretch of the imagination. Still, even if that's how the pyramids were built in Snefru's time, it's not how the pyramids at Giza were built. We'll come to that in just a few minutes. Snefru's reign lasted around 24 years, and when he passed away in 2550 BC, his son Kufu took the throne. If you've heard of Kufu, that's because this is the guy, the big daddy-o of pyramid builders, the one who'll turn Giza from flat place with some sand to wonder of the ancient world. Kufu's full name was Khnum Khufui, which means the god Khnum protect me, but which looks something like H.P. Lovecraft might come up with when he needed to hit a deadline. We actually know less about Cthulhu R'lyeh than we do about his dad, but...
And sometimes you'll hear him referred to as Cheops, and the reason you have different names for the same people is it just depends entirely on what language you're talking about. Like we use the name Jesus to refer to the guy from the New Testament. In Hebrew, he was Yeshua. And both are correct. And Yeshua can also mean Joshua. So it's kind of the same name. It means the same thing, just in a different language. So it just depends on what language we're dealing with.
We do know how the ancient Greeks felt about him, and that was not good at all. In the traditions of the ancient world, Snefru was the wise and good king, while Kufu and his son Khafra were tyrannical despots who ruled Egypt with iron fists. Herodotus even claimed Kufu sold his own daughter into prostitution to fund his pyramids.
But let's be clear, though. Herodotus, while he's one of the earliest historians we have, and a lot of what we know comes from him, take everything Herodotus says with a grain of salt.
Since Herodotus is infamous for just making stuff up, you should probably take that particular legend with an industrial-sized pinch of salt. In fact, the West
I have not seen this video before, I swear.
Car Papyrus actually depicts Kufu as a good and just king. But really, when a guy is this ancient, it almost doesn't matter what kind of man he was. What matters is what he did. And
It mattered to the people at the time. I understand what he's saying, though, is that this far out from history, our concern is more about what he did, not about who he was.
Did was build the greatest pyramid of them all. Construction on the Great Pyramid started almost the moment Khufu arrived on the throne. The choice to build at Giza was a very deliberate one. It set the new king apart from his dad, who'd done his building some 30 kilometers away. It was also on a plateau, meaning everyone could see it from far away. The nearest complex was that of the sun god Ra, implicitly tying Khufu to divinity. The man chosen to oversee construction was Khufu's nephew, Hemiunu. Hemiunu's an interesting guy. We found statues of him depicting an overweight dude with a nice pair of moobs, which is
moobs. I was just thinking, he's got some serious man boobs, and for them to have actually put that into the sculpture of him is quite something.
Monument builders. But he's also interesting because he's the one who marshaled Khufu's resources to create the Great Pyramid. Before work even began, Hemiunu tasked a bunch of civil servants with working out exactly how many blocks his creation would need, which was a mean feat of calculation. That done, he prepared the site for what would surely be the biggest engineering project yet undertaken by humanity.
But a smart move to start that way, and I'm sure the king didn't care. He's just like, build it, and I want it as big as possible. But to sit down and actually calculate that is a good chunk of the work. And man, the numbers involved, I mean, it must have just made their head swim when they realized how much was going to have to be done.
Hemiunu wouldn't be using Snefru's method of conscripting agricultural workers. Oh no. His vision for a workforce will upend everything you thought you knew about pyramid building. So we might as well get this one out of the way. Did slaves build the pyramids at Giza? The simple answer is no, they didn't. The more complex answer is no, they didn't, but the story of who really built the pyramids is all kinds of interesting. Over recent decades, we've uncovered evidence of who built the two lesser pyramids at Giza, meaning we can work backwards from this
Makes
to
sense.
hypothesize who built the Great Pyramid. The picture is very different from the biblical slave narrative. Rather than being chained up, the builders had their own special villages capable of accommodating around 20,000 people. That's a lot of people, and when you have that many people shifting around giant blocks of stone, there are going to be accidents, hence all the bodies we've uncovered with broken bones. But here's the thing, rather than simply being left to suffer, injured pyramid builders were given the best treatment that the ancient world could buy. Archaeologists have found skeletons with expertly set fractures, and even amputations done so cleanly that the patient lived for decades after.
That's impressive, especially at that time in history, because even up to 150 years ago, there was no sure thing that an amputated limb meant you survived, even with the advances that we've made in the intervening years. I will say this. The reason it's complicated, and he may get into this, is that even if you're dealing with skilled laborers, as I mentioned earlier, who are actually building the pyramid, it takes an incredible force of support workers to support those skilled laborers. And I don't know how prevalent slavery was in Egypt at this time. I would guess it was at least somewhat used, just from when you conquered other groups and you enslaved some of those conquered tribes, just as most cultures did at that time. They may have been providing the food. They may have been making bricks or making other things like tools. I mean, there's probably a place that enslaved people fit into all of this, even if they weren't directly working on the pyramids.
Here at Geographics, we've done videos on projects like the Panama Canal and encountered dreadful tales of bosses exploiting workers and letting them suffer on with horrendous injuries. Yet here we are, discussing a building project from over 4,000 years ago, and the workers were getting treated humanely. Progress is not always a straight line, kiddos. Another aspect where the workers were cared for was in their diet. They ate a lot of protein, consumed a lot of beef, and were generally in excellent nutritional shape.
A lot of calories.
These guys were valued far more than slaves would have been. But what about...
If you're working in the desert with the massive amount of weight that is being moved around, you are exerting a ton of calories. And they obviously understood that.
The construction itself. How did these well-fed workers haul all of those multi-ton blocks into place? Well, moving them really wasn't that difficult.
Yeah.
The main blocks were cut from a quarry just 800 meters from the Great Pyramid itself. They were then dragged, likely by oxen, to the building site. In fact, they may have been dragged by humans. Experiments conducted in the 1930s showed a mere 6 men could move a block, provided a wet clay track was there to drag it along. Once they'd reached the pyramids, the blocks were likely hauled up earthen ramps to get them into position. Since this would have been an arduous task, something the builders had machines to help them. Herodotus wrote of great machines used in pyramid construction. Now, if you're used to watching the History Channel, you're probably expecting us to now declare that we're not saying it was aliens, but it was definitely aliens. But no, we're really not saying it was aliens. Herodotus' description of the machines makes it clear they would have been part of a primitive wooden lever system. And that's
part of the problem, and this covers a lot of areas of history, is that when we can't wrap our mind around complex topics, we just go to a simple solution. And the average person who doesn't know too much history, who doesn't dig too deeply into the history, just assumes that long ago people were primitive. They were basically borderline cavemen who couldn't possibly have done anything complex. But we know that there was incredible intelligence here, and just their understanding of the stars and of science was far further along than we give them credit for. And so they absolutely were able to figure out how to build things like this. It's the same thing when you deal with assassinations and things like that, and people want there to be conspiracy theories. We don't want to think that a regular Joe could have done something, so we try to assign all these complex theories to what happened. We don't want to think that 4,500 years ago, ancient Egyptians could build something like that, so it must have been aliens. No, people were pretty smart.
Really, if they even existed. Rule number 1 for ancient history, people: Herodotus talked a lot of crap. The final part of the Great Pyramid was the limestone casing. Today the pyramid appears brown, but in Khufu's time it would have been a brilliant white.
Yep.
Huge blocks of limestone were cut from quarries in Tura, nearly 13 kilometers away, and brought up the Nile using boats to be placed on the outside of the pyramid. It's possible the Egyptians even temporarily diverted the Nile to let their boats come closer. While most of this limestone was stripped away and stolen in the following millennia, the very top of the smaller Khafra pyramid still has its original casing. We guess they just left it there to show you what you're missing out on. Around 2527 BC, after 23 long years had passed, the Great Pyramid, it was at last finished. By now, 2.5 million blocks had been laid, creating
Amazing.
a 147-meter tall structure.
Absolutely
weighing
amazing.
Almost 6 million tons. It was the biggest, tallest building the world had ever seen. A building so big, its height wouldn't be surpassed until Lincoln Cathedral got its spire in 1311 AD. But although we know it as the Great Pyramid, it wasn't the only pyramid built that was worthy of that name. With Khufu's tomb finished, the Egyptians were about to embark on a pyramid-building spree. By the time they finished, the face of their kingdom would have been completely transformed.
What's amazing, though, is that no one ever tried to build one bigger, because this one was so massive and so big that most of the others were just like, I'm not even going to bother. I know how much work went into that.
If your mental image of pyramids comes from old adventure movies, you may be vaguely imagining the completed Great Pyramid as a rabbit warren of traps and curses waiting to lure
Not
the
much
unlucky
inside.
traveler in. Sadly, real life is much more prosaic, and the actual internal structure of the pyramid is fairly basic. Rather than being hollow, it's almost entirely solid, with one main passage leading down and another passage leading upwards. Take the upwards passage and you'll find the Grand Gallery and King's Chamber, with the Queen's Chamber off a side passage. Head downwards and you'll go underground into the unfinished subterranean chamber. And aside from a couple of ventilation shafts, well, that's about it. Oh, and there's also no precious treasure in there because looters took them all away way back in the ancient past. Yet, even this is grandiose compared to the interior of the second pyramid built at Giza, Khufu's Pyramid. But while Khufu's pyramid might have very little going on inside, its exterior was almost as impressive as its predecessor. A mere 5 years after his Great Pyramid was finished, Khufu died and finally got to make some use of his gigantic megatomb. He was succeeded on the throne by his son, Rediadef, but Rediadef apparently sucked at being king because he lasted a mere 8 years before being replaced by his brother, Khufu.
I was going to say, I've never heard of him, and that's probably why he wasn't on the throne long enough to do anything to leave behind like a big pyramid.
Significantly, the pyramid Rediadef had started building was torn down and destroyed, suggesting Khufu made him hand over the throne by force. The upshot of all of this dynastic squabbling is that Khufu found himself in charge of a fourth dynasty at the height of its engineering prowess. And what's a megalomaniac ancient king to do with such an opportunity? Why, build a bloody great pyramid, of course. Khufu's pyramid is the second biggest of the three at Giza, standing only slightly smaller than his father's. And we really mean slightly. There's a 2-meter difference in height. Almost like Khufu was saying, look, I respect you too much to overshadow you, Dad, but seriously, I could totally build a pyramid bigger if I wanted to, okay? But if Khufu held back where size was concerned, he went to great pains to demonstrate his superiority. The Great Sphinx is thought today to have been built by Khufu, and it may even have his features.
And no, Napoleon did not shoot the nose off, and actually when Napoleon was there 200 years ago, it was up to almost the neck in sand, and it's been uncovered since then.
It's true, then the whole world knows roughly how he would have looked without a nose, which is both weird and also weirdly impressive. The Sphinx is a monumental work, in and of itself, standing 20 meters high and stretching out over 70 meters. It's attached to an entire complex far more intricate than anything Khufu ever built. Interestingly, we don't actually know what the ancient Egyptians called it. Sphinx is a Greek word that cropped up some 2,000 years later. One theory is that maybe the word Harmaket was used, as this was the name it was given during the New Kingdom, roughly a millennia later.
And he mentions the New Kingdom, and so there was something that happened. What we're talking about right now is like, what, in the 2300s BC? Around 2200 or in that neighborhood, in that century somewhere, we have worldwide something that scientists called the 4.2K or 4.2 kilo year event, which is that somewhere around 2200 BC, worldwide, there was some kind of event that caused the collapse of multiple civilizations, possibly the Indus River Valley civilization, a civilization in China, the Old Kingdom of Egypt, even civilizations in the New World in North and South America. All at about the same time. Now, as a Christian, I would say, hey, that's about when the Bible says Noah's Ark all went down with the flood, but there's no evidence to support that, but we know something happened. Something happened around this time, and a lot of people say it was some kind of a drought. Maybe it's caused by a volcano, some change in the weather that happened, but something happened that caused the collapse, and that's why you don't see these massive pyramids happening after that, because the Old Kingdom collapsed.
And it's possible they just called it Simon, because, ancient history, we just don't know. Anyway, when Khufu died, it must have seemed like the only way was up. From now on, pharaohs would be constructing bigger and better pyramids until the entire nation was covered in pointy bits. But that's actually not what happened. Little would anyone alive at the time have known it, but Khufu's pyramid would be the last truly great pyramid that Egypt ever constructed. From here on out, things would be all downhill. The final pyramid at Giza is Menkor's pyramid, built by a pharaoh who was likely Khafre's son. But compared to the other two structures at Giza, it's something of a disappointment, like listening to a glorious symphony that ends with a wet fart. Only a tenth of the mass of the Great Pyramid, Menkor's tomb tops out at 61 meters, not even close to half the height of
Still
its
decent
brothers.
size.
It's tempting to assume that Menor was just a modest guy, someone who didn't need to show off like his ancestors. But that doesn't actually seem to be the case. As the 4th dynasty gave way to the 5th dynasty, pyramid building continued, but on a much smaller scale. No longer were the pyramids such grand edifices. No longer was the construction of such good quality. By the time the 6th dynasty appeared, such great structures seem to have fallen entirely out of fashion. We know this because the last great pyramid builder was Pepi II, who reigned some 300 years after Khufu's crazed building spree. Great here is a relative term. Pepi's pyramid barely rose above 50 meters. In the centuries after he died, it apparently came across as so unimpressive that locals used it as a quarry. And this probably isn't a coincidence, but after Pepi II died around 2150 BC, some sources say after a 94-year reign, but that's probably an exaggeration, the entire central government system collapsed.
Here it is.
And it did this completely and utterly. Ancient Egypt's old kingdom, it just sort of fell apart. Oh, sure, a 7th and 8th.
And it wasn't just there. Like I said, this was happening all over the world at about the same time.
Dynasty followed, but they were short-lived and ineffectual, and likely held no real power. Within 20 years of Pepi II's passing, Egypt was racked by instability, central governance was but a memory, and political violence and famine had gripped the region. In such an environment, who had time for building pyramids? It wasn't until 300 years had passed that a plausibly unified state reappeared with the advent of the Middle Kingdom. Although the Middle Kingdom would build pyramids, they would never again reach the heights or complexity of the Old Kingdom. And once the Middle Kingdom finally collapsed around 1630 BC, well, that was it. That was the end point. After that last attempt to reclaim the 4th dynasty's greatness, no more pyramids were ever constructed in Egypt. What's remarkable?
Now they start dealing with temples, and they start doing the tombs like in the Valley of the Kings, where you're digging into the existing ground and you're trying to prevent robbing and things like that.
Is that this near millennia of pyramid building all took place in the impossibly ancient past. Even when the Middle Kingdom collapsed, it was still in an era so far back it practically counts as prehistory. The Trojan War, as described in Homer's Iliad, wouldn't happen for another 400 or 500 years. The Iliad itself wouldn't be written until 8 centuries after the last pyramid went up. 8 centuries. It's the distance between you and the birth of the Aztec Empire, more than the distance between you and the Black Death. It's almost as much as the distance separating you from Genghis freaking Khan. Of course, this is the sort of thing that I could go on about all day, finding funky historical events.
But those are great ways to describe it, because when you think about events like that, you think about how long ago they were. And that's perspective, because for us, perspective is ancient Egypt is all kind of happening at the same time, when in reality, it lasted for a long time. And they were as far separated from each other as we are from some of those events that seem in our distant past.
And it's closer to the present than ancient Egypt. Yet, there is a point to all of this, I promise. If we just tell you that the pyramids have been standing for 5,000 years, it sounds impressive, but sort of beyond comprehension.
Yeah.
Hopefully, by giving you at least a few reference points, we can make it clear just how long these ancient megastructures really lasted. Today it's thought that there are somewhere between 118 and 138 pyramids in Egypt. Of course, most of them are nowhere near as magnificent as the Great Pyramid or Khafre's Pyramid, or even the pyramids of Snefru or Menor. Yet, even so, they all remain. All of them are reminders of the first and perhaps the greatest civilization of the ancient world. And the ancients themselves, they seem to have recognized this. When Philo of Byzantium came to write his list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world in 225 BC, he made sure to include the pyramids of Giza.
Yep.
He made sure to include the monuments that, to him, were already over 2,000 years old. And that longevity, it continues to this day.
And if you're talking about the wonders of the ancient world, what else are we talking about? The Mausoleum of Helicarnassus, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Temple of Artemis. I think there's a statue of Zeus. I'm sure I'm forgetting one, the Lighthouse of Alexandria.
After all the other ancient wonders vanished beneath the surface of Time's river, the pyramids remained, still defiantly standing, as they likely will for another 4,000 years. In telling the story of the pyramids, you also tell the story of the passage of time, of how the world changes and civilizations rise and fall. It's comforting to think that no matter what happens, no matter where the future takes us, these great monuments will still be sat on the Giza Plateau, a single constant.
Not going anywhere.
In a changing world. They may have been intended as the tombs of ancient kings, but today the pyramids are something more, an important reminder of just how far the human race has come. So I really hope you found that video.
Yeah, that was really cool. And if you have specific videos on these topics, especially ancient Egypt, I'd love to do some more. Give me some suggestions as to channels or specific videos you'd love to see me take a look at, and we'll do that. And if you haven't already, please check out the new channel, Stories of the Great War. I'll put a link up in the description, as well as at the end of the video here. Thanks.